I came across this story from Japan the other day, and it was one of those things that just stops you cold. A 12-year-old girl from Thailand, found in an apartment in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo, where she had been trafficked and sold for sexual exploitation. You feel that initial, predictable wave of horror. You wait for the part about the arrests, the network, the buyers. But then, as I read deeper into the coverage, the story took this bizarre, unbelievable turn. The spotlight, in one of Japan's biggest weekly magazines, swung right past the Japanese men who were arrested. It swung past the alleged Japanese ringleader, and it landed, with blinding intensity, on her mother. And then it zoomed out even further to blame the entire social culture of Thailand. As if the root problem wasn't the men buying a child in one of the world's wealthiest countries, but the culture of the poor country she came from. It was such a deliberate, perfect narrative flip, it was almost impressive, if it wasn't so disgusting. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the infrastructure of exploitation in Japan. We're looking at the foundational layers, the economics, the media, the cultural norms, and the legal structures that really enable this kind of impunity.
Right. Our mission is to analyze exactly how this narrative flip happens, investigating the demand-side drivers, the systemic vulnerabilities, the obsolete laws, and the media structures that allow for blaming victims and their countries of origin.
Instead of focusing on the domestic demand.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on domestic demand and impunity, we're essentially pulling back the curtain on how a modern, wealthy society exports blame while importing vulnerability.
And that opening story you shared is, I think, the perfect entry point. It's a perfect illustration of the social mechanism that protects the whole system.
How so?
Well, when you start analyzing the Japanese context, you have to first acknowledge its foundational homogeneity. For decades, the proportion of non-Japanese residents, or gaikokujin, has been incredibly small.
Right.
Even as recently as 2020, it was hovering at around 2%. And that demographic reality, it just fundamentally shapes public perception.
2%, that's negligible in terms of daily interaction for most people, unless you're in a big city center.
Exactly. So if your neighbor isn't an immigrant and your child's classmate isn't an immigrant, where does your whole understanding of the foreigner even come from?
It comes overwhelmingly from mass media.
Yeah.
In societies with these historically low foreign-born populations, public perception of the gaikokujin is just so heavily influenced by constructed images. Stereotypes, yeah, that are spread through major news outlets, through entertainment, and it often overrides any positive personal interactions people might have. This media-constructed reality becomes, the default setting for public opinion.
That is a powerful and frankly disturbing concept, that the media can essentially colonize your understanding of a group you barely even interact with. Is there research that shows this disconnect?
Oh, absolutely. There was one ethnographic study that looked at Japanese workers in a machine factory in Gunma Prefecture.
The same prefecture from the opening story.
The very same one. And the workers initially, they expressed this deep anxiety and doubt about working with foreign nationals. They made very clear, prejudiced statements like, there is no way we can work together with a gaijin.
So that's the societal narrative speaking, right?
That's exactly. That initial hesitation, that prejudice, it's reinforced by years and years of living in a homogeneous society. But here's the fascinating twist.
Okay.
Once they started working side by side on the factory floor, they developed a genuine sense of fellowship, a nakama ishiki, with the foreign workers.
So they built real bonds.
Real bonds, regardless of nationality. They recognized the shared struggle of the work.
So the personal experience, it overrode the prejudice.
Not entirely.
Right.
And this is the critical insight. The researcher noted that once those Japanese workers stepped outside the factory and returned to the wider social environment, that hard-earned sense of fellowship, it just failed to override the powerful negative images they held of foreigners in general.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They might say something like, my coworker from the Philippines is great, but then still hold this generalized anxiety and suspicion toward a foreign-looking person on the street.
That's astonishing. So they admit, I know it's wrong to automatically judge foreigners as suspicious, but the societal framework, the media framing, it's just so powerful they can't stop doing it.
Exactly. The prejudice is internalized as a sort of necessary caution.
And that mechanism, the media framework, dominating personal reality, that's the first defense layer for the system of exploitation.
It is, which makes analyzing that framework so crucial. And that's why we have to look at the giants of Japanese media. the conservative Yomiuri Shimbun and the liberal Asahi Shimbun.
Okay, let's unpack this power structure. We're talking about massive organizations. Yomiuri with what, over 10 million copies in circulation, Asahi over 8 million. They're not just news sources, they are actively shaping national consciousness.
And this analysis compared their coverage across two key periods: the height of the bubble economy in the late 80s, and then the more recent period of severe demographic crisis from 2016 to 2019.
So what were the big differences back in the first period, 87 to 90?
Well, during that early period, Japan was grappling with a huge labor shortage. The economic boom was part of it, but also Japanese workers were increasingly refusing what were known as the 3K jobs, katanai, keiken, kitsui.
Dirty, dangerous, and demanding.
Exactly. So foreign labor was suddenly necessary, but culturally it was resisted.
And how did the conservative giant Yomiuri respond to that?
Yomiuri was statistically far more likely to focus on the frame of social problems foreigners create.
The classic threat narrative.
A classic. This narrative directly connects immigrants to negative outcomes: crime rates, illegal work, deteriorating public order, a generalized sense of social instability. It positioned the labor shortage not as a domestic failure of wages or working conditions,
but as an international problem, population pressure somewhere else that was being thrust upon Japan.
That's the external threat narrative, personified. And you see it in specific articles where Yomiuri framed foreigners as fundamentally more likely to become illegal by overstaying visas or working illicitly. They used this social problems frame nearly 60% of the time in that era.
Wow. And what about the liberal paper, Asahi?
Asahi adopted a fundamentally different approach. They are statistically much more likely to frame the issue around the problems foreigners face. They dedicated significant coverage to multiculturalism and systemic racial or ethnic discrimination.
So that's where you'd see the coverage of things like the controversial fingerprinting system they imposed on foreigners.
Precisely. Asahi gave serious analytical space to that in the late 80s, framing foreigners as victims of government discrimination. They were twice as likely as Yomiuri to cover racial or ethnic discrimination in that early period. A much more sympathetic, almost advocacy-oriented stance.
But it's not that simple, is it? Because the conservative paper wasn't purely rejectionist.
No, and what's critical is that Yomiuri, despite its focus on social threats, was paradoxically more likely than Asahi to frame foreigners in terms of their economic contribution.
Which highlights the tension.
It's a total schizophrenia. We need them to do the dirty work our citizens won't touch, but we're afraid of what they'll do to our society. The economy needed them, but the culture resisted them.
So let's fast forward. From the worries of the 80s to the undeniable demographic crisis of 2016, how did that change the conversation?
Well, by the 2016-2019 period, the need for foreign workers was just. It was undebatable. Japan's population decline was accelerating. The government was forced to acknowledge they had to broaden visa statuses.
The conversation shifted.
It shifted from how to prevent foreign entry to how to accommodate and sustain the country using foreign labor. And this unavoidable reality, it forced both papers to increase coverage of the positive aspects. Both newspapers saw a statistically significant jump in covering the positive aspects. Foreigners bring integration, multiculturalism, and explicit recognition of their economic contribution. Yomiuri's mention of positive aspects nearly doubled. Asahi's coverage shot up from 22% to 58%.
But the fears didn't just vanish, did they? They just professionalized.
That's a great way to put it. The nature of the problems foreigners create shifted dramatically. It moved away from those abstract fears of crime and public disorder.
Which actually decreased for both papers.
Right, and it focused heavily on fiscal problems foreigners create. This is the critical maturation of the discussion. Once you acknowledge the need for foreign workers, you have to acknowledge the realistic cost.
It's not philosophical anymore, it's practical. What will this cost us?
Exactly. Concerns about using Japanese taxes for foreign social services, the strain on the health insurance system, the need for new support infrastructure, all of that became statistically significant. It's the practical, calculative anxiety of a wealthy nation suddenly having to budget for a new, permanent population.
And that context is so vital. It creates a rationalizing framework where domestic problems get externalized. We saw that in the initial story blaming Thailand's culture instead of Japanese demand, which sets the stage perfectly for the next part. The engine of exploitation itself, the demand-side culture that relies on systemic vulnerability.
Right. If the media sets the stage for blaming the foreigner, the domestic economy sets the stage for creating both vulnerable victims and willing consumers. And nowhere is this more visible than in the sheer scale of Japan's adult video, or AV industry.
Which generates what, an estimated $5 billion annually?
That's the number, a massive industry. And it relies on a mechanism that researchers have identified as involuntary consent.
That phrase alone, involuntary consent, it's a moral and legal contradiction. How is something like that culturally institutionalized?
Well, it's rooted in a deep cultural mechanism, the difficulty of saying no. In a society where cultural norms heavily discourage confrontation, direct refusal, or standing out.
Especially when dealing with authority or contracts.
Exactly. In that context, the modern Western legal concept of firm, autonomous consent becomes profoundly fragile, and the industry exploits this ingrained tendency.
So let's break down the mechanism of deception. It's not usually, outright coercion in the sense of a gun to the head. It's more of a systematic, psychological, and contractual trap.
It is, layered on top of economic need. The process often starts deceptively simply. Recruiters, maybe from talent agencies or modeling scouts, they approach women, sometimes fresh out of high school, sometimes in their early 20s.
And they hook them with legitimate-sounding aspirations.
Yes, they're given vague promises. Are you interested in modeling or perhaps being a TV personality? And they're reassured, just sign this registration contract. You can choose which modeling job you want. If you don't want it, you don't have to take it.
But once that contract is signed,
the trap snaps shut. Many of these women had absolutely no intention of ever performing in AV, but they're suddenly held to that piece of paper through various forms of what are called empty threats.
What are these empty threats specifically?
They can range from the threat of enormous financial penalties for breach of contract to the threat of legal action, or even just the simple but devastating threat of public exposure, that their content, which they might have been tricked into filming once, is already out there and can't be withdrawn.
And that psychological leverage forces them to keep participating. They feel they can't afford to quit.
Exactly. Because of the social and financial repercussions. The contractual obligation, which they couldn't clearly refuse culturally, becomes a coercive chain.
And this issue, it's bigger than just the AV industry. It's fundamentally linked to Japan's labor market precarity.
Absolutely. We're talking about deep-seated economic vulnerability. Around 40% of the entire labor force operates as temporary or non-regular workers. For women, especially, secure, regular employment is extremely rare.
Which leaves a huge segment of the female population with very limited economic choices outside of vulnerable sectors.
Right. So if you're economically marginalized, you're looking for any way out. The initial lure of modeling or easy money becomes irresistible, and the coercion that follows becomes inescapable because the alternative is often dire poverty.
It's a paradox of needing financial independence but being forced into a system that strips you of personal autonomy.
And here is the profound connection. The consumers are often victims of a similar economic precarity. Many of the devoted fans of the AV industry are men who came of age during Japan's employment ice age. That generation from the 90s and 2000s that really struggled to get stable full-time jobs.
So the same economic insecurity is shared by the performer and the consumer. Men who are now in their 30s and 40s, stuck in non-regular contracts, renewing them year after year.
They're financially and socially marginalized. Because of their lower socioeconomic status, these men often struggle to find partners or to date or to engage in expensive social interactions like traditional hostess clubs.
The social infrastructure that traditionally provided outlets for middle-class men has failed them.
It has. But they can afford AV.
Right.
Purchasing an adult video, which costs around $25, or attending one of the associated events, it offers a form of personalized, affordable interaction. They can attend handshake events, talk briefly with the actresses, and feel a sense of connection that the mainstream social structure denies them.
So this broad economic precarity, the inability of both groups to access secure social and economic standing, it fuels the demand for this whole system of exploitation.
It's an economy built on marginalized people serving other marginalized people.
That is a staggering realization. Exploitation functioning as a cheap social safety valve for men suffering economic collapse. Now, let's drill down on the cultural root of this, the concept of the self and consent.
Okay, so we're shifting into cultural anthropology here. Historically, the concept of the self in Japan is profoundly relational.
Meaning your identity is defined by your social roles.
Exactly. Not by some internal autonomous sense of being, but by your roles. I am a daughter, I'm an employee of this company, I am a teacher. The group, the institution, the family, that defines the individual.
Which is a huge contrast to the Western concept, where the autonomous individual self is the foundational unit.
Right. And modern legal concepts like consent, they presuppose this standalone, autonomous self of person, capable of making a firm, independent decision regardless of social pressure. This strong articulation of I choose or I refuse didn't really exist in the public consciousness until pretty recently.
So if your identity is fundamentally defined by social obligations and roles, how do you, as an individual, even possess the cultural framework, let alone the emotional fortitude, to stand against the social pressure of a contract or an authority figure?
You don't. It creates a profound vulnerability. The relational self makes clear, firm refusal the very bedrock of modern legal consent, a near impossible cultural act in many professional settings.
Which is precisely why the AV industry's use of involuntary consent is so effective.
It exploits a fundamental dissonance between a traditional relational culture and the demands of modern contractual society. It means the system isn't just coercing individuals, it's capitalizing on a deep, systemic, cultural inability to say no.
And that complexity of consent provides the cultural lubricant for the whole infrastructure of trafficking. So now we need to shift to how this demand is supplied, focusing on the actual mechanisms and the vulnerable populations that traffickers target.
Right. And unfortunately, Japan maintains its status as a country of origin, transit, and destination for human trafficking. The victims arriving in Japan are incredibly diverse, coming from Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, but also increasingly from Eastern Europe, Russia, and Latin America.
All drawn in by the perception of economic stability and high wages.
Yes. But once they're there, the methods traffickers use are often systemic, designed to create immediate, inescapable debt bondage and coercion.
How do they do that?
They're expert at exploiting legal loopholes. One common method is using fraudulent marriages between foreign women and Japanese men. This gets the women into Japan with a legal visa.
But then they're immediately forced into exploitation.
Immediately. In bars, clubs, or massage parlors. And the control mechanism you mentioned, debt bondage, is critical to maintaining this coercive relationship.
Absolutely paramount, I'd imagine.
It is. The recruitment debts imposed by traffickers, often through illegal overseas brokers, can sometimes exceed a year's projected salary for the victim. So they start their lives in Japan already financially enslaved.
And there was that tragic example of the Colombian victim.
Yes. She was lured in with a false promise of work as a dancer. She was given a fake passport, a Dutch one, to get into the country, and the criminal organization immediately confiscated it,
creating immediate total dependence.
She was then prostituted relentlessly until she could repay a staggering debt of 4 million yen. That's over 36,000 US dollars. And brothel managers will regularly impose arbitrary fines on victims for made-up misconduct, ensuring that this debt is perpetually renewed or increased.
They're trapped.
They're trapped. They're forced to pay back their employer for basic things like housing, food, and medical care, which just locks them in the cycle of economic coercion.
And beyond foreign nationals, there is this huge, highly organized domestic ecosystem of exploitation, often connected to what's been termed Japan's infantilized sex culture.
This is a devastating point where cultural demand meets domestic vulnerability. The attraction of men to lolicon, the concept of women or girls with the prepubescent appearance, and the cultural construction of the ideal woman, often derived from anime and manga, contributes significantly to the demand for child sexual exploitation.
Which feeds a culture where some men, maybe those identified as otaku, retreat into a virtual world and perceive the ideal woman as an unreachable, non-challenging anime character.
And that leads to a disconnect from adult, real women. Yeah. And it creates this perverse cultural normalization of child sexual imagery. Multiple international reports have noted that many forms of media, specifically manga and anime, containing explicit images of sexualized children, remain largely unregulated.
Despite decades of international pressure.
Decades. And this permissive cultural context, it sets the table for organized domestic child trafficking, like the JK business.
Joshikoze high school girls and the organized network around them. How does that system operate?
The JK business involves organized prostitution networks that specifically target vulnerable Japanese minors. These are often runaway girls, those facing extreme poverty, or those with cognitive disabilities who lack adequate support.
And it doesn't always start with sex.
No, it escalates. They offer services like simply taking a walk, an osenpo, or providing conversation or non-sexual massage as a raifure. But these activities rapidly escalate into sex trafficking. Recruiters systematically target them in public places, near schools, or increasingly through online platforms.
So it's an industrialized system preying on domestic vulnerability, hidden in plain sight. And we can't overlook the less visible exploitation of male youth.
No, male prostitution certainly exists. The underlying economic principle is similar. Young boys providing companionship or sexual services to older men or wealthy women for pay, often to afford rent or university fees.
And they face immense health risks.
Immense risk of STDs and HIV/AIDS due to the high rates of unprotected sex demanded by sex buyers. And there is a devastating legal loophole here that protects the demand side.
What's the loophole?
It's a critical failure in the legal framework. The key statutes, specifically the obsolete 1956 Prostitution Prevention Law, legally define prostitution only in terms of vaginal intercourse.
You're kidding.
Because of that archaic definition, other forms of commercial sex, including homosexual prostitution, are often legally excluded for the most severe prohibitions. This loophole just makes prosecution under existing laws incredibly challenging and gives the perpetrators, the buyers and traffickers, increased impunity.
Shifting back to the foreign labor supply for a moment, Japan runs these major government programs to fill the 3K labor shortage, but critics argue they're structurally flawed, like the Technical Intern Training Program or TITP.
These programs, meant to transfer skills or address labor gaps, they create immense risk for foreign migrant workers, especially for labor trafficking and debt-based coercion. And the overwhelming evidence from NGOs and international bodies points to one shocking fact. For many years, the Japanese government has historically failed to identify any labor trafficking victims within the TITP program.
The absence of identified victims isn't evidence that trafficking isn't happening.
Well,
it's evidence that the official identification and screening system is completely blind to it. It's a willful blindness.
It is a systemic flaw, and it's primarily rooted in the financial structure. The main failure lies in the Memoranda of Cooperation, the MOCs, signed between Japan and the sending countries. They're supposed to prevent exploitation, but they remain utterly ineffective in stopping recruitment agencies from charging excessive, often illegal fees to the workers.
So the worker is already in debt before their plane even takes off. They're immediately compromised.
Precisely. Those fees, often equivalent to well over a year's wages back home, saddle the workers with immediate insurmountable debt. This debt bondage is the key driver of coercion. It makes the workers incredibly compliant.
They can't complain.
They dare not complain about wage theft, unsafe conditions, or abuse, lest they be deported without repaying the debt, which would ruin their family. And the system reinforces this by making it nearly impossible to escape an abusive employer.
Because TITP participants are tied to their original employers.
Historically, yes. Even after minor reforms, the barriers to changing employment remain prohibitively high. It effectively traps workers in abusive workplaces. The threat of deportation, combined with that crushing debt, renders hundreds of thousands of workers vulnerable to forced labor.
And this brings us to the final and perhaps most infuriating layer of protection for the exploiters: impunity. If the demand is high, the infrastructure is robust, and the victims are coerced, the only thing left to stop the system is the law.
And the legal and judicial framework in Japan seems almost designed to guarantee that this system remains profitable and low risk for the perpetrators. The term fragmented barely captures the legislative chaos.
There's no single unified anti-trafficking law.
No, not one aligned with the 2000 UNTP protocol. Instead, trafficking crimes are prosecuted using a patchwork of disparate, non-comprehensive statutes, many of which are completely obsolete.
Like that 1956 Prostitution Prevention Law you mentioned, a law from the 50s is being used to govern a modern, multi-billion-dollar commercial sex industry.
And the law states clearly, no one may engage in prostitution or be a sex buyer. It sounds comprehensive. But here is the profound legal paradox. The 1956 law provides no coercive sentence whatsoever for the sex buyer.
None.
None. The buyer, the demand side, the person who financially fuels the crime, faces virtually no real legal deterrent under this primary statute.
So the men who drove the exploitation of that 12-year-old Thai girl in Gunma, the buyers, are essentially given a pass by the most commonly cited law on the books.
And furthermore, the penalties for inciting others to buy sex in public are ridiculously low. A maximum fine of only 10,000 yen, roughly $90 US. For an organized crime syndicate, this is less than the cost of dinner.
It's the definition of regulatory failure. And these legal gaps are compounded by a judicial system that, astonishingly, seems committed to a soft-touch approach. Let's pause on these judicial statistics, because this is where the system's priorities become absolutely clear.
The statistics are damning. They expose where the political will truly breaks down. Penalties for sex trafficking often allow for fines in lieu of imprisonment. This is structurally disproportionate compared to sentences for crimes like rape, which often mandate prison sentences of at least 4 years.
So what are the actual consequences for convicted traffickers?
For at least 6 consecutive years, the data shows an almost unbelievable pattern. Courts issued either fully suspended sentences of imprisonment or fines to the majority of convicted traffickers.
The majority.
In recent years, that figure has consistently reached 67% or more.
Let's just pause on that. More than 2/3 of convicted human traffickers people responsible for human bondage, for severe psychological trauma walk away without serving time in prison. What does that statistic tell us about Japan's political and judicial priorities?
It tells us that the judiciary prioritizes minimizing disruption over obtaining commensurate justice. The risk for the trafficker is low, the potential profit is high, it makes the business immensely viable. This is impunity made manifest.
And why do prosecutors allow this? Why not use stronger laws like the Labor Standards Act, which can carry up to 10 years imprisonment?
The system incentives work against seeking justice. Prosecutors operate in a highly competitive environment where their conviction rate is paramount to their career progression. Many reportedly avoid using laws with higher penalties because they perceive that those are far more likely to trigger lengthy appellate process.
So they fear the case will go to appeal, and if the appeal fails, it hurts their conviction rate.
Exactly. They prioritize maintaining a high volume of convictions via soft penalties, like fines or suspended sentences, over risking their professional reputation by fighting hard for commensurate justice. It's a system optimizing for administrative efficiency and personal career advancement, not for justice.
And the final injustice is the re-victimization that happens at the hands of the state itself. The narrative flip we saw in the magazine, blaming the Thai mother, is mirrored in how victims are treated domestically.
Yes, official identification procedures are notoriously inadequate. Japanese authorities have historically maintained an incredibly narrow definition of a trafficking victim. They failed to recognize children in commercial sex as trafficking victims unless there was demonstrable force, fraud, or coercion, or, critically, unless a third party facilitated the act.
So if the child was coerced directly by the buyer, or if the coercion was purely economic due to poverty, they weren't counted as a trafficking victim.
Correct, which is in direct violation of international standards. And as a consequence, potential victims, including children, were routinely treated as delinquents or criminals.
Counseled on their behavior instead of being screened for exploitation, they were essentially punished for the crimes committed against them.
This re-victimization is tragic. Authorities often inappropriately penalize victims, arresting them, detaining them, or forcibly deporting them for unlawful acts they committed as a direct result of being trafficked, like immigration violations. The system just compounds the trauma.
And even if a victim is identified, the protection services are insufficient.
Deeply insufficient and unevenly distributed. For male victims, the situation is dire. There are no dedicated government shelters that can accommodate them.
Not at all.
None. Any male victim identified has to rely on ad hoc accommodations arranged by NGOs with no guarantee of sustained government support. And for women and children, the bureaucratic requirements are often unacceptable.
How so?
Women and children seeking government shelters in less resourced prefectures were sometimes required to quit their jobs or schooling for secrecy purposes. They're essentially forced to choose between their immediate safety and their long-term economic stability and education.
So we've spent this deep dive unpacking a complex structural system.
We have. We've seen how a high domestic demand for commercial sex and labor exploitation is insulated by cultural silence, reinforced by media narratives that blame the victim or their country of origin. And this system is ultimately protected by an obsolete, fragmented legislative framework and a lenient judicial system that favors suspended sentences and fines over real prison time for traffickers.
It's a structure of systemic impunity, where cultural dynamics, economic precarity, and the judicial soft touch all converge to protect the demand side. But here is the final, most provocative thought that ties back to the story we started with, the 12-year-old girl from Thailand. While domestic law reform is essential, international reports note that Japan already possesses the legal capacity, the extraterritorial jurisdiction, to prosecute Japanese nationals who engage in child sexual exploitation overseas.
That power is already on the books. It means they could prosecute Japanese men engaging in sex tourism in other Asian countries under their own domestic laws.
But despite this critical authority being legally available, international monitors have noted that Japanese authorities have failed to report any investigations or intent to exercise this critical authority for years. The challenge, therefore, isn't a lack of legal capacity to fight demand both at home and abroad, but a profound and consistent lack of political will to aggressively prosecute the demand side. The government has the legal tools to disrupt the system. What is missing is the necessary priority to use them.